So this week's Parsha is Parsha's Vaeirah. It's named Vaeirah because it begins with continuing the dialogue that last week's Torah portion ended off with between Moshe and Hashem. So at the end of last week's Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem, Lama harayoi salam hazeh, why have you done bad to these people? And then this week's Parsha opens up with Hashem responding. And Hashem's response largely begins with Vaeirah el Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I appeared to your forefathers with these names and not with that name, as we talked about at length last week. So the Vaeirah and I appeared is where the name of the Torah portion comes from that dialogue. Now, this week's Torah portion really, last week was was tying up the lead up to the slavery and then talking about the slavery itself. This week we're going to get into the beginning of, or the lead up, let's say, to the Exodus, to leaving Egypt, which a large part of which, obviously, at least the dramatic part of which, is the 10 plagues. So we're going to get into that this week. Now, just before we get started, Mitzrayim, and there are references to this in a number of Midrashim and different texts. Mitzrayim, Egypt, was the first exile and the first really oppression of the Jews as a people. And one could argue technically that we weren't necessarily technically the Jewish people yet, but we were the family, the community that was going to become formally the Jewish people shortly thereafter. So this was the first, unfortunately, of many large-scale oppressions of the Jewish people. And Mitzrayim really is an archetype. It's this archetypal representation of the oppression of the Jewish people. And that is actually reflected in the name Mitzrayim. The Hebrew word for Egypt, this was the slavery and oppression in Egypt. The biblical name for Egypt is Mitzrayim. And just to put this, to illustrate this visually, you know, I guess I'll leave that for now. I'll erase more than necessary. So, Mitzrayim, in Hebrew, that's the Hebrew word Mitzrayim, for Egypt. Now, when you read Hebrew in a Torah, in a Sefer Torah, in a Torah scroll, it doesn't actually have vowels in the Torah scroll, which is why you need to be familiar with what it's saying. If you want to read the Torah out, it's going to be hard if you're not familiar, if you haven't prepared in one way or another, either by just being sufficiently familiar with the text to know what it says, or by specifically preparing the text, because there are no vowels and you could get stuck. So in the Torah, if you were to look at it, now obviously this isn't the same script and the same lettering as you'd find in the Torah, but this is the way the word would be written with no vowels. It's still the same word. Now, we can do something interesting here. Change the vowels. Same word, same letters. Meitzarim. Probably, I think the best English word for that would be constraints. Things which hold us back. Things which suppress us is maybe a better word than hold us back.
Narrowness.
Sorry?
Narrowness.
Right. So, Meitzar, technically, the probably most generic technical description would be narrowness. Contextually, I think the best way to translate it would be here a constraint, which is something narrowing. It's cutting down and limiting your options, your ability to operate, your ability to behave in the way that you should, in the way that you really want to, etc. So the name Mitzrayim, the biblical name for Egypt, actually represents this idea that the slavery in Egypt was not just a specific incident, an occurrence of slavery, but it was the archetype of this oppression of the Jewish people, both physical and spiritual. And there's a tendency for those to go hand in hand. So it follows from that things that we see about the slavery in Egypt and then the exodus from that slavery are going to carry particularly important lessons for us today, because we are in a golus, we are in an exile, we don't have the temple in Jerusalem, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, etc. And Mitzrayim is this original archetype of all the various goluyos, exiles, that we have experienced and continue to experience. And the Exodus from Egypt is the archetype of all the exoduses, however that word would correctly be pronounced, but getting out of exile and golus. So if we could look at what happens here and take some very important lessons for us today, if we can identify some of the key factors that contributed to the Jews getting out of Egypt, we should be able to see how those factors are keys in breaking out of this archetypal Mitzrayim, constraints, exile, things that hold us back, and then apply that to our life today to be able to break out of, first of all, individually, the challenges and constraints that we experience, and then by extension of that, breaking out of Golus to get to the ultimate goal, which is Mashiach, which is what this is all about at the end of the day, bottom line. So we're going to look in now, and obviously the most high-profile factors that contributed to the Exodus, or some of them at least, were the plagues. So we're going to look at a couple of the plagues, beginning with the first two, and see what they represent and what they could mean to us today. So up to paragraph 3 in the Hebrew, there's a little marking there on page 110, where it starts inside. In the English, this is sort of a little bit awkward. On page 23 in the English, it's paragraph 3 in the Roman numerals. So it's at the top of the right column on page 23. So I'm going to go from the Hebrew. So Hamakos shenitnu Mitzrayim, the plagues that were applied to the Egyptians, Rak heim hechilu lishboros tokev koshi hagolos. They initiated the breaking of the intensity of the exile, of the oppression, of the Golos. So this was the beginning of the process of getting towards redemption. Every single one of us is facing Meitzorim, constraints, our own Egypt, in our own individual life. And if the plagues were the beginning of the process of breaking out of that, and that is representative of what we're going through, then the plagues should represent things we can do to start the process of breaking out of our own constraints and the things that are holding us back. אם שיהיה בבחינת מצרים דקדושה, מצרים דקדושה, היינו שהעבודה היא לפי טעם ודס, ומשום כך היא מוגבלת מצרים, ואם שיהיה אפילו בבחינת מצרים דלאום הזה, היינו שקיים חסרון גם בעבודה שעל פי טעם ודס. So, there are a couple of different ways that this could play out practically, because obviously we're not all facing the same challenges. Every one of us is facing specifically different challenges, obviously, but there are also different categories of challenges, or we could say perhaps different classes of challenges. And within each of our experiences, we probably have some that are in one category and some that are in the other category, roughly speaking. And we can make progress and shift our challenges from one category into another category. So the first, it's actually not the first one listed here, it's the second one listed here, and I guess that's perhaps being optimistic and listing the more ideal category of challenges first, but I'm going to go in the opposite order because I think it's clearer that way in terms of explaining it. The first category of challenges is classic textbook challenges. It's hard for me to do the right thing. I want to do the wrong thing. I'm tempted to do the wrong thing. I'm tempted not to do the right thing. And it's a challenge, and that can be as trivial as it sounds when we just describe it like that. It's not trivial at all in real life. It can be extremely difficult, and it's designed, our life experience is designed intentionally for these challenges and constraints to be extremely difficult. And again, here again, we see the individuality that, you know, what is extremely difficult, challenging constraint for one individual will seem completely trivial to someone else, and it doesn't challenge them at all. But then you'll find something else that will be the reverse, that's not challenging the first person, but it's extremely difficult for the second one. So that's just the reality of the way things go. We have different challenges. It can be difficult to do the right thing. It can be difficult not to do the wrong thing. And the fact that something's easier for someone else doesn't mean that it's not valid for that to be exceptionally difficult for me. Because I'm me and I'm not them. I'm not you. I have different personality. I think differently. I feel differently. I experience differently. And different things. Some things are going to be more challenging for me than for some of you, and some things are going to be less challenging. That's just the way it goes. So there's no way anyone can ever judge the validity of someone else's challenges and how difficult something is. So there's this first category of challenges, which is the challenge to step up to the plate and do the right thing, or to not do the wrong thing. But then there is perhaps what we might call a higher battleground. So it is possible for someone to get to a situation in which they're relatively stable in their service of Hashem and in their Torah and mitzvahs, and, doing something against Shulchan Aruch, for the most part, isn't a challenge that they face. It's possible to get there. And I point out and would say for the most part, because I think that everybody's going to have it to some degree. But, the challenges that we're all facing today are challenges that it's possible for us to get beyond, or at least some of them, the more basic and therefore perhaps more important challenges for us to tackle. What's most important for us to tackle today, because it's the most fundamental, is something that we may possibly be able to move beyond and put behind us. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to have challenges, but we're going to be playing on a different battleground. So if a person gets beyond the challenge, for the most part again, of wanting to do the wrong thing and struggling to do the right thing halachically, and a person's pretty much got that down pat and is, relatively stable in behaving according to Shulchan Aruch, according to the Code of Jewish Law, and doing what the Code of Jewish Law says to do and not doing what it says not to do, there's still a whole lot further than we can go. And this is again where individuality is going to come into play very much. There are some people who naturally just like to go all the way and do things, full on to extreme degree, and some people who are much more conservative by nature and like to just sort of take things one step at a time and do things in a way that I feel secure and comfortable. And each of those approaches obviously has its merits. But it's very easy, for example, to get stuck within our comfort zone and to say, look, this is what I can do. I'm following Torah mitzvahs, I'm following halacha, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm doing everything I need to do. But I'm doing it and approaching it in a way that's comfortable, and I've got it down pat, and it's under control, and I've got this. Now, I could perhaps challenge myself and say, you know what? No, get over yourself. I'm not going to just stick to my comfort zone. Yes, I've achieved a tremendous amount in terms of getting to a situation in which I'm stable in halacha and technically doing everything the way I need to do it. But there's so much more that I could be doing if I would have the guts to look myself in the mirror and say, get out of your comfort zone. And the terminology that's used here in the text is to go lamala mitam vadas, to behave in a way that's beyond that which I calculate as being technically appropriate. And that can become sort of very gray, because it's very easy to justify why I shouldn't do something, because it's risky, it's not conservative, it's not traditional, it's not the way that I've done things in the past, I'm not so sure it's a good idea. And all of those can be valid claims, and I'm not discounting the validity of any of those claims, potentially. But it's very easy for me to take those claims which can be valid and to extend them into being excuses for me to do things in a way that I'm comfortable with and not to push myself beyond the boundaries of my comfort zone. So my comfort zone can also be meitzorim, can also be constraints that are holding me back and stopping me from going beyond what I'm comfortable with into the realm of being able to achieve incredible, great new things because I had the guts to let myself be a little bit uncomfortable. So the more basic level of meitzorim is constraints, is the challenge to do things that I'm halachically not allowed to do. and the temptation or the laziness to not do things, or it's not necessarily lazy, but the interest, the personal interest I have in not doing some of the things that I do have to do. That's the more basic and fundamental level of constraints, is those challenges. But even once a person gets beyond that, there are still the constraints of our comfort zone. And you know what? It's the nature of life is that it never ever goes away. Again, we can change the battleground further, and I've got my halacha down pat, and now I'm gonna say, you know what? I still have constraints. I still have my comfort zone. I'm gonna identify the things that I really am very comfortable with, the fact that it would be fine for me to do, even though it's uncomfortable. I'm not going to necessarily go all the way and just pick the riskiest and most controversial thing, but something that's pretty safe bet. It's just out of my comfort zone. And you know what? I'm going to push myself to do it. I'm going to step outside my comfort zone. I'm going to step out. I'm going to have my own exodus from these constraints, from these Mitzrayim, from this Mitzrayim, from my personal Egypt, these constraints. And you know what? It can be really hard. And again, just referring to it like this generically, it can almost seem silly. And maybe objectively, technically it is. But the bottom line is, what counts is our experience. And experientially, it can be extremely difficult. Which is why actually stepping up to the plate to break out of our comfort zone, even though for someone else the exact same action would just be, a walk in the park, is an incredibly powerful thing, and that's how we make progress, and that's what makes some of the greatest differences in the world, and what gives the creators the most pleasure is when we push ourselves to do these things. So I push myself to break out of my comfort zone and do something that I'm not particularly comfortable with, and I do it again, and I do it again, and I commit to doing it, every day, or 3 times this week, and then 5 times next week, and then every day the week after. And then if I keep that up 3 months down the road, chances are that will have just become a part of my comfort zone. Now, not necessarily, but generally speaking, chances are if we do something repeatedly, it becomes easier and more comfortable, and eventually that which was entirely outside of our comfort zone has become part of our comfort zone. So our comfort zone has grown. It's become a little broader. But you know what? There's still going to be something outside our comfort zone that we could do more. And it may just be another action, it may be a change in intensity, it may be a change in the people we interact with or the way we interact. Whatever it is, there are so many different possibilities of how we can break out of our comfort zone. But no matter how much we do it, we are always going to have a comfort zone, and there will always be Mitzrayim in our lives. We will always have Egypt. We will always have constraints in a comfort zone, which we need to, if we want to really maximize our potential and live up to why we're here, we'll need to invest in breaking out of. And it will always be there. There'll always be another layer of comfort zone. As we break out of that, there'll be another one waiting and another one waiting. So everybody has Mitzrayim. We all have constraints in our lives. And, there are different battlegrounds, obviously. And we have the ability to make progress and move from what we might call a more basic battleground to a more advanced battleground, and from there we can move further and further and further and increase the level to which our battleground is advanced. But we can always keep doing that. It's not like there's a top level and then, you clock the game and you have to find a new game to play. It doesn't work that way in the game of real life. There are always more levels. So, considering that every one of us has constraints, has Mitzrayim, has Meitzarim in our lives, let's look at the plagues and see how we can apply the ideas of some of these plagues to how we can break out of our own constraints. And to bring, it says here, through the makos, the plagues, which were an intermediate, a tool which was used to break the oppression, the slavery, the exile in Egypt, if we can take the ideas that those plagues represent archetypally and apply them to our own constraints and Mitzrayim in our life, in our avodah ruchnis, at the bottom of that the middle-ish long paragraph in the left column of page 110, which means avodah ruchnis shebedugmas hamakos, if we can break through and advance in our spiritual work, our spiritual mission and purpose, and to make progress there, using that which is represented by the plagues in this week's Torah portion, we can also break through and weaken the strength of the constraints in our lives and allow our souls to become freer than they are. The same way that the plagues broke the Exodus in Egypt and allowed us to become free, we can use the ideas that are represented by these plagues, apply them to our constraints, and allow ourselves and our souls to break free of the challenges that we're facing. So up to Dalet now. It's left column, 2/3 of the way down on page 110 in the Hebrew. It's probably just 4 in the English. The first plague, as is relatively well known, I think, was the plague of blood. That was the first step in beginning to break the oppression and exile in Egypt. The waters of the Nile River and everything else in Egypt, basically all of which came from the Nile and comes from the Nile, because the Nile still today, if I'm not mistaken, is the source of water for Egypt. All of it turned to blood. Tivam shel mayim hu kriros velachos. So water generally is cold and wet. Kriros hifucha shel kedusha. Coldness is the opposite of holiness. Shekain hakedusha hi chiyunius k'may shenema ba'avos Rabbi Nosson. Asara nikro chaim v'rishona nimnasham hakadosh baruch hu nikro chaim la'achrav kol ele shedveikim hakadosh baruch hu. Chiyunius mevia chamimus. So there are 2 parts to this. Number 1, water is cold, generally speaking. Obviously, you can heat up water, but chances are, water tends to be colder, let's say, than body temperature. Most of the time, if you go into water that hasn't specifically been heated up, you're going to feel cold. It's as simple as that. Cold is a lack of, first of all, at a very fundamental physical level, cold is a lack of movement. That's what it is. When you heat something up, what's happening at a molecular level is the molecules are vibrating. And as they vibrate more and more quickly, and the vibrations get bigger and faster, it feels hotter to the touch. Which is why, incidentally, there's actually, technically, physically, cold is primarily a lack of heat. And there's actually 0 degrees, for example, 0 degrees Celsius is just an arbitrary number. They picked, okay, 0 degrees Celsius, we're going to find the temperature at which water freezes to ice and call it 0, find the temperature at which water evaporates or water boils and call it 100. We have 0 and 100, but it's not like 0 means there's no heat. It's not an absolute 0, there's a complete lack of heat energy, and the proof is you can have negative temperatures. And the same is true of Fahrenheit. I'm not sure exactly how they arbitrarily picked those numbers, but whatever it is, it's the same thing. There are negative temperatures in Fahrenheit. There is a scale of temperature called Kelvin in which there's 0 and there are no negatives. Because 0 degrees Kelvin means there is 0 energy in the molecules. And it's a hypothetical. It's not something that you could ever physically achieve, because there's no way to extract energy. How do you cool something down? You put it in a fridge, you put it in a freezer, you put it in an environment that's colder, and the fridge absorbs. You put warm food into a fridge, the fridge is cold, because the fridge has less heat in it than the food does. It absorbs the heat naturally diffuses from the hot food into the cold environment, and then the food becomes cold because its heat energy was absorbed away from it to the cold. So you make something cold by exposing it to a greater lack of heat, an environment that's colder, and then its heat gets pulled away. You can never make something reach 0 degrees by exposing it to a colder temperature, 0 degrees Kelvin, because 0 degrees Kelvin is a total lack of heat energy. It means that the molecules are not vibrating. There's 0 vibration, 0 movement. There is no heat energy. None. 0 Celsius and 0 Fahrenheit are arbitrary. 0 Kelvin means actually 0, no heat energy. What does it mean? It means that the molecules aren't moving. So, in a very real and physical way, heat is movement, heat is life, heat is animatedness. Now, we could see that perhaps in ways also that are a little bit less technical. What happens when people get excited? People will tend to get flushed in the face. Why do you get flushed? Your body temperature rises. Your body wants to let some of that heat off, so blood comes out to the skin and it can radiate heat and lose heat out to the atmosphere. So when people are excited, are lively, what happens? We get warmed up, we get heated up. Our face may get flushed, for example, which is because we got warmer or hotter, because we got more lively. So warmth, and it's, I guess, because of all of this, perhaps, this extends into general descriptions. When you describe someone as a warm person, part of what that tends to mean is that this person is very much alive. When you say that someone's cold, it will tend to mean that they're stoic, that they're not very animated, that they're not very lively. When a person's warm, they're open, they're more animated, they're more lively. Because warmth is actually very technically, physically, at the submolecular level, life and movement. It's a form of kinetic energy, of movement energy, that we perceive as being warm or hot. So water, which represents cold, represents the opposite of life. It represents an absence, a lack of life. And life is generally associated with kedusha, with holiness, with that which is sacred. Because what is the original form of life? That which is absolutely, truly, and absolutely alive is God. There's God, which is alive, and then there's nothing except for that which God decides to make exist. So the greater something's connection to God is, and the greater the degree to which it resembles God, the more alive it's going to be. So if we are going to say that liveliness is holy, it's sacred, it's godliness, it's divinity, that is life, and warmth represents life, warmth is technically movement and liveliness, and cold is a lack of liveliness, a lack of movement. Even technically, it's a lack of movement and vibration. So if water represents cold, it represents that which is lacking in excitement, liveliness, passion, and by extension of that, life is holiness, godliness, divinity. So cold largely represents this lack of divinity, lack of godliness. And that's a big part of what water represents. So back inside now, second paragraph of 4. Tivam shomayim hu krios v'lachos. Water is cold and wet, cold and moist. Krios hi hefucha shel kedusha. Cold is the opposite of holiness. Shekena kedusha hi chiyunios. Holiness is life. It says in this midrash, Avos Reb Nosson, Asara nikru chaim, there are 10 things which are called alive or life. Rishon nimna sham HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The first one counted obviously is the Creator, is God. Nikru chaim is called alive. Ola'achrav kol ele shedvekim Hashem. Afterwards are listed things which are connected to God. The more connected something is to the source of life, the more alive it's going to be. Right? If you take a bunch of appliances and plug them into outlets in the wall, and some of them have really weak wires with which they're plugged in, they're not going to be able to operate at full functionality because they're not getting a full flow of current. The greater something's connection to the source of energy, to the outlet in the wall, the more current can flow to the appliance or the device, the more optimally it's going to be able to function. The greater one's connection to the Creator, to God, the source of life, the greater the degree to which it will be alive. So chiyunius mevia chemimos. Life brings warmth. No, I'm not going to go there. But liveliness.
Killed the fish. So is the blood supposed to be like heat, which is alive?
Perhaps what we could say there is that those fish represent specifically, the life or part, a subset of the life of Egypt, of the constraints. And this is not obviously a stereotypical use of blood. right? So perhaps the idea there is that the blood, and we're going to get into what this represents, and we're going to develop this further. When that happens, you can kill perhaps the fish of Egypt, the elements and the sub characteristics of these constraints which are holding us back can then get killed off by this liveliness and connection to godliness that we have. Does that make sense?
It was overwhelming.
Something like that, I think. And again, it's a suggestion because it's not, this, I haven't seen that specific question addressed in text, so I'm thinking out loud.
I kind of see it as Harsina, where we were overwhelmed by God's Kedusha.
Okay, yeah. So now, bottom line of left column, page 110, Nimtza, what we have now is Shehakrirus, the cold, Shehi Hifucha Shel Chamimus, which is the opposite or a lack of heat. Hifucha Shel Chayos Shebekdusha is not quite synonymous, but perhaps a metaphor for the lack of life of holiness. So we have liveliness, animatedness, life, holiness, godliness, cold, lack of vibration, lack of animatedness, lack of liveliness, lack of godliness, lack of divinity.
So in this sense, kind of what we're explaining, then how can you compare the Torah to water?
Okay, so that's a good question. I would address that relatively generally by saying that the reason we use a lot of metaphors, we use metaphors for God, we use metaphors for Torah, all these things, is because a big part of this picture is abstract and intangible. So the degree to which we can do it justice by actually directly addressing it and describing it is very limited because it's abstract and intangible. So we use a lot of mashalim, a lot of metaphors, a lot of analogies. Now, the reason why we use a lot of metaphors and analogies and not just one is because there is no perfect metaphor. So we'll pick something which has a strong element, which is a good metaphor for a particular idea. And then for another idea, another piece of information about Torah or about God, we will choose something else which represents that idea. So there are specific things about Torah which are represented very effectively by water as a metaphor. Obviously, it's not going to be the cold versus hot thing, primarily, although we are going to get to some of that as well. But, right, so different metaphors and analogies are coming to address different ideas. And because we're addressing something which is, infinitely deep and broad and abstract and intangible, we use lots of different metaphors to address different ideas. And there will always be some degree of contradiction between some of the peripheral elements of those metaphors, which is why sometimes it's good to ask questions like that so you can really zero in on what part of this are we actually using as a metaphor and what is sort of just incidental and tangential, because you can't just discount all the other things about blood or about heat. What we can say is that that's not part of what we're using this as a metaphor for.
Yeah, because then you can, I guess, also say like blood is a form of impurity and death.
Correct. So blood is one of the greatest sources of impurity under some circumstances.
And this one is life.
Right, so correct. So it is important to just make that distinction and understand that the metaphors we're using, they're all partial metaphors. There's no complete metaphor for God or for Torah. And because there are so many different things going on, we use lots of different metaphors, and each one has a specific function or a specific idea that it is a metaphor for, rather than being a metaphor for everything, because there's nothing that's going to do that. So now, cold, which we're saying water is generally associated with, represents the opposite of life and the opposite of godliness. Hamuvan haruchni shebedavar. So what is going on here spiritually? What are we supposed to take away from this in terms of spirituality in our service of Hashem? We have to break through the coldness, being cold. And what does that mean? If there's something, some sort of part of godliness, of service of God, of service of my purpose, of following Torah, that I am very cold to. I don't feel connection with it. I don't feel excited about it. I don't feel passionate about it. I feel cold towards it. Hare hi meilida dvarim hamenugadim l'kedusha. The outcome of that is going to be invariably, to a degree, and to varying degrees in varying examples, obviously, there are going to be things that will be outcomes of that will be opposite to holiness, to godliness, to divinity. Mishum kach hoisa hamaka rishona b'mayim hamasamlim es hakrios. This is why the first plague was addressing and attacking the water which is cold. So step number one, and interestingly, actually, there halachically, it says, and obviously this is at the level of Mishnah, and we have to give the fine print practically, but it says that even if there is a snake that's come and wrapped itself around your foot, around your ankle, you don't disturb your davening for it. Now, obviously, if there's an incident, if there's any sort of credible threat of danger, you stop what you're doing, and you don't necessarily run, because it's not always the best idea to run, because that may be dangerous, but you do what you have to do to stay safe. Let's not take this, to a degree that's going to be causing danger and a threat to safety. That's not what it's saying. Many snakes, and I don't know whether this is true, but I suspect it may be true, that the majority of species of snakes are not dangerous, are neither venomous, nor, the larger snakes that are going to suffocate something. Most snakes, I suspect, because it just seems like it might be true, and I may be wrong, but it doesn't really matter, are not dangerous. Certainly some are not dangerous. Now, if it's dangerous, you do what you have to do to stay safe. But it also says that if you see a scorpion approaching, you run. Now, there's an idea that this represents is that snake and snake venom is associated in Midrash with being hot. And the venom of a scorpion is associated with coldness. If you're davening and you experience this venomous heat, you get excited and passionate and distracted by thoughts of excitement and passion about things other than davening and other than Hashem, which we're supposed to be focused on. It's not ideal, but you don't have to run. It's not the end of the world. In fact, the upside of that is that it means you're alive and you have passion and excitement in you, and it's just that we then have to figure out how to take that passion and excitement and divert it towards what we should be excited and passionate about. If we're trying to daven, we're trying to connect with godliness to get inspired, and we feel stone cold, that's a dangerous situation. And this is something that, having done miftzoim and Merkah Shlichus and traveled around and encountered people, when you find someone and immediately, as soon as, they sense that you're interested in discussing Judaism, they become aggressive, you have what to work with. First of all, you can get into a discussion and an argument, and, not an argumentative discussion, let's say, and potentially you can get somewhere, and at the very least, you can have an animated and lively interaction with another person, and your souls can interact with each other, and you can never overstate the impact that can have, which you may or may not ever find out about or be consciously aware of. When you find someone that's completely ambivalent and couldn't give a hoot, that's really, really difficult to work with, because they're just like, yeah, whatever. I don't care. What are you going to say now? You're really up against a brick wall when someone's cold and doesn't care. So, being cold, being ambivalent, is very, very dangerous. And it leads, if the bottom line is, even if I'm technically observing the rules and doing everything technically the way I'm supposed to, but if I feel completely cold and ambivalent about it, the chances of that lasting and of the complete integrity of my observance remaining for a substantial period of time is very, very low. Because I don't really care about it, which means that slowly, look, we're human. everybody cares about something. Everybody's going to get excited about something. And if we don't feel any excitement and passion and interest in Torah and mitzvahs, even a person who's just a cold person by nature and a relatively ambivalent person, there will be something that will excite them. And if I can't manage to get myself to have any sort of excitement about Torah and mitzvahs, I will find excitement about other things, and that will pull me away. So it's of utmost importance, and this is step number 1. The first plague that came along to break through the exile, the constraints of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, the Mitzrayim and the constraints, and to break through that stronghold was dam. Taking water, taking cold, ambivalence, a lack of animatedness and a lack of life, turn it into blood. Turn it into blood, which is the source of life. It's warm. It's what keeps us, it's what... effectively is, calling it the source of life is probably a relatively accurate way of describing it. Technically, you may say that it's not the source of life per se, but I don't think it's unfair to describe it as that, roughly speaking, a source of life. Which is why losing blood is a very, probably one of the stereotypical things that people think of associating with trauma and danger. One of the things that a person's going to, first and foremost associate with danger is blood, loss of blood. Because loss of blood equals loss of life force. And there are both physical and spiritual components to that, which work together. So, Hatorah madgisha es sug hamayim shebehem. Okay, you know what? I think we're going to do a bit of a sort of express here so we can get to the second part, because we're going to address the second plague as well. So we're going to take this a little further and pick on some of the details to emphasize them, but I think I'd rather get to the second one than get carried away with every single detail of the first one and then miss out on the second one. Where are we going to skip to? Okay. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Where does this transition into the second one? So you know what? I don't want to spend time trying to figure out where this transition happens. I'm just going to address it outside. So, plague number 2 was Vaeirah, frogs. Frogs, what do you think of when you think of frogs? Slimy, wet, cold. So what's going on here? We just said that the first step to breaking through the constraints and the Egypt, the Mitzrayim, the Mitzrayim, is to take the cold and wetness represented by water, the ambivalence to holiness, and to turn it into blood, to make it into that which is warm and animated, vibrant, a source of life. Get excited and passionate about godliness, about Torah, about mitzvahs, about divinity, about the purpose of existence. Get warm and animated about that. That's the first and most foundational step in terms of breaking through and starting to move towards both personal and collective redemption. Why then, if that's so important in step number 1, is step number 2, plague number 2, what seems to be the diametric opposite of that, which is cold, wet, slimy frogs? And the answer is that there are 2 sides to the coin. And they are literally opposites, 2 sides of a coin. Holiness and that which is unholy. And very technically, that which is unholy is literally technically the opposite of that which is holy. That may seem redundant, but it's not. But I'm actually not going to go down that road as much as I'd like to. don't have time. So we have holiness on one side of the coin and that which is unholy, lack of holiness, unholiness on the other side. So gesund, bless you. Whilst it's important to work on becoming, and this is step number one and the most foundational step, on becoming warm, inspired, passionate, it's important to make sure that we are being careful to become animated and inspired and passionate about the right things. Because if we just work on becoming a more passionate and excitable person, that can go both ways. Passion isn't necessarily a good thing. It's a good starting point because it means we have potential to get passionate, to be or to become passionate about the right things. But it does also allow for being passionate and excited about the wrong things. And so here's where plague number 2 comes in. Plague number 2 is saying that whilst you're focusing on becoming excited and passionate and taking that cold ambivalence, water-like nature and making sure to warm it up and to turn it into blood, into that which is warm and animated and vibrant and a source of life, make sure that you're applying that specifically to the things that it should be applied to. Make sure you're becoming passionate and excited about the things that you should become passionate and excited about. And if there are things that you're finding yourself passionate and excited about that you shouldn't be passionate and excited about, then you send in the frogs. Then you cool down, you work to cool down your passion and excitement about those specific things. So those specific instances of passion and excitement. You don't say, oh, well, passion and excitement's dangerous, I want to become a colder person. No. What you do want to say is, I want to cool off my passion and excitement in this specific instance or about this specific thing. So it's the counterbalance of plague number 1. It's the counterbalance of the first step, which is why when Moshe and Aaron threaten Pari and tell him, by the way, if you keep up these games, you're going to get a plague of frogs. It says that the frogs are going to be everywhere and in your houses, etc., and in your ovens. The frogs, which represent cold, wet, jumped into the ovens, into the places of greatest heat, because metaphorically this is what it represents. It represents finding that heat, but not heat, excitement, passion about the right things, heat, excitement, passion of Egypt, of Mitzrayim, of Mitzorim, of constraints, the passion and excitement that we have which is holding us back because it's directed at the wrong things, at the things we should be cold and ambivalent about at best, or at least I should say, and to cool off that passion and excitement. And so this is step number 2. The frogs are coming along and saying, don't just get carried away and think that all passion and excitement is good. If your passion and excitement is the fire in the ovens of Egypt, of Mitzrayim, of Mitzorim, of constraints, and you're passionate and excited about something that's holding you back, then you send in the frogs to cool it off. But the order here is specific and deliberate and intentional. We don't start with the frogs. We start with turning the water into blood. We start with getting passionate and excited. We start with taking coldness and making it warm. Taking water and making it into blood, becoming excited and passionate. Because that is the driving force and foundation of progress and moving forward. That's step number 1, without question. Then, step number 2, we might say, is perhaps almost like damage control of step number 1. Right? Because we're human, and being human is very complicated. And chances are, if we're ramming up our passion and excitement and liveliness, it's not unrealistic to expect that that may have repercussions in terms of because we're working on becoming more animated and vibrant, that we may become more animated about some things also that we shouldn't be. Because we're working on becoming a more animated person overall, a more passionate and excited person overall, that may spill over into places where it would better not be. So then step number 2 is the plague of frogs, is cold. Taking the cold and sending it into the ovens, but only into the ovens of Egypt. The ovens of the Jews, the frogs didn't go into. The ovens of Mitzrayim, of Meitzorim, of constraints, the passion which is misplaced and therefore holding us back, that's where we send in the frogs. But step number 2 only comes after step number 1. So the first and foremost thing to do is to work on, and practically what this means is learning, becoming more aware, empowering ourselves with information so we're more aware of godliness, of divinity, of our purpose, of why we're here, of the meaning and value of Torah and of mitzvot and all these things. And the more we learn, the more we understand, the more we get it and relate to it, and the more it becomes a part of our perspective, naturally the more animated and excited about it we are going to be. That's step number 1. Do that first. Then, once you've started working on that, step number 2 could be, okay, now that I've managed to get myself motivated, excited, passionate, vibrant, alive, I'm going to go around and, check my passion and my excitement and just make sure that it's not in places that it shouldn't be. And if it is, I'm going to send in the frogs. I'm going to work to cool down, send the frogs into that specific oven, into an oven, an Egyptian oven, an oven of Meitzorim, an oven that's holding me back. A warmth, heat, passion, excitement that's a constraint and holding me back from becoming who I am and doing what I'm here to do. So they're both very, very important steps, but the order in which they played out, step number 1 versus step number 2, is also intentional and very, very important. And I'm going to call it a day and take questions.
So the frogs, they went everywhere, but they only went in the Egyptians' ovens, not the Jews'.
Correct.
But why?
Because it was a plague against the Egyptian people. All the plagues were like that.
But
The plague of blood.
Meaning for it was being it has meaning for us. Right?
It has meaning for us. And where were the frogs sent? Into into Egyptian territory. The frogs were sent in to cool down the passion that was a passion of constraint, a passion that's holding us back because it's in the wrong thing. Right? All the plagues affected the Egyptians. If a Jew and an Egyptian would drink from a cup with 2 straws, the Jew would get water and the Egyptian would get blood from the same cup. So, and this is because the idea of the plagues and what they represent is to apply it to the places in which, because there is a place for being ambivalent and cold also, and that's ambivalent and cold about things that are the opposite of godliness and holiness and Torah and mitzvahs. Right? So there is a certain coldness and ambivalence which has a place and is a good thing also, which is exactly why we're sending in the frogs, to cool things down in the specific environments in which they should be cold, which is things that are the opposite of godliness and Torah and mitzvahs. Make sense?